U.S. policy toward Cuba has given refuge to countless Cubans fleeing communism. But a Sun Sentinel investigation found it also has opened the door to criminals who've robbed American businesses and taxpayers of more than $2 billion over 2 decades. Many run back to Cuba flush with cash and beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. The United States makes it easy. The Cuban Adjustment Act, passed nearly 50 years ago for humanitarian reasons, gives Cuban nationals rights not available to any other immigrant group, and criminals are taking advantage of that. Cubans are welcomed into the country even if they arrive illegally. They're eligible for a green card after just a year. If they commit a crime, they have 2 choices: run to Cuba to evade American justice, or stay in the U.S. with little risk of being deported because Cuba will not accept them.
It's the only group that has their own special immigration law, period.
The Sun Sentinel examined court cases and data to provide the first comprehensive picture of the staggering scope and cost of this illegal activity. While the vast majority of Cuban immigrants are law-abiding, a small faction has specialized in certain crimes that can yield enormous sums of cash. Medicare fraud, cargo theft, indoor marijuana farming, credit card, and insurance fraud.
The United States has opened its doors to Cuban refugees through the Cuban Adjustment Act. This is an extraordinary immigration offer, and one that the United States has extended for humanitarian and for political purposes. It is offensive that criminals and fraudsters are abusing this privilege, and it's equally offensive that the Castro regime is taking advantage of this and allowing these criminals to take illegal profits back to the island.
The criminals are funding life here and in Cuba. They've smuggled millions in cash to the island and bought houses and cars with money stolen in the U.S., some living luxuriously by Cuban standards. The Sun Sentinel found that criminals shuttle back and forth from the island, intent on committing crimes in the United States and escaping prosecution.
They come here to make some money for a few months, and then they go back until that money runs out, and then they come back to make some more money, and they just go back and forth like that.
The Sun Sentinel traveled to Cuba and found Cuban fugitives living openly on the island. Livan Moya Tagla is wanted in a $1 million credit card fraud in Texas. He lives in Santa Clara in central Cuba. Moya wrote to the judge in his case last year saying he went to the U.S. to steal. He dared American authorities to come to Cuba to look for me. Do it if you can. The Sun Sentinel also found Angel Ricardo Mendoza, who admitted stealing a truck with $180,000 in nickels from the Federal Reserve. Mendoza has been living in Santa Fe near Havana for a decade. Mendoza, on Interpol's most wanted list, still carries his U.S. green card and Florida driver's license. He's only about 100 miles from Key West, but can't be touched by American authorities. The criminals operate in rings that range from small cells to highly organized groups of up to 100 people. They specialize in nonviolent, lucrative crimes. The rings recruit people from Cuba. New arrivals unload stolen goods and cargo heists, lend their names as owners of sham medical clinics, and stage car accidents to rip off insurance companies. Some work in marijuana grow houses to repay the smugglers who brought them to America.
One massive auto insurance fraud ring that we investigated shows how organized these criminal rings can be. The scam involved 21 South Florida clinics that stole $18 million from auto insurers. Recruiters paid people to be in staged car crashes and sent them to the clinics. The clinics then billed insurance companies for treatment of fake injuries. The accused ringleaders were Cuban immigrants who were going back to Cuba almost weekly. Millions of dollars ended up in Cuba. IRS agent Pamela Martin testified at a court hearing last year.
Individuals were buying properties and taking money to Cuba, and they were also having other individuals smuggle it to Cuba for them. They have family down there they were supporting. They were buying homes for their family there.
When the FBI started making arrests in the case, 5 of the main organizers disappeared. They fled back to Cuba and still haven't been captured.
I have many clients here, Cuban clients, that are funneling money back to Cuba, that they tell me stories and live very comfortably in Cuba with the illegitimate money that they're able to obtain here in the United States. Yes, they own their own homes, they have more than one car. I mean, just to own a car in Cuba is the equivalent of being a millionaire here in the United States.
Criminals who don't want to return to Cuba have another option. They can take their chances with the U.S. legal system, do their time, and stay in America. The United States typically deports criminals who aren't U.S. citizens, but Cubans are an exception. More than 34,000 Cubans who have been ordered deported are still in the U.S. because Cuba won't take them back. And criminals know that.
I've had many instances where they'd roll up the piece of paper and toss it at me and say, this is what I think of your removal order. I'm Cuban. I'm not going anyplace.
At least 3 defendants in the $18 million auto insurance fraud ring had deportation orders for earlier crimes, but are still here. Several others benefited from the unique status Cubans have under U.S. immigration law. They arrived without entry visas and were allowed to stay under the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966. The law has helped more than 1 million Cubans rebuild their lives in the U.S., but it also aids the criminal rings.
Should we as American citizens look the other way while people abuse of a law that is, again, one of the most generous in the history of the world, probably, in terms of immigration laws and policies directed at a specific group? I think this policy is deeply flawed, and we have to find a way to reform it. I'm not for eliminating the Cuban Adjustment Act, but we certainly need to tighten it.
It should be used only for those who are fleeing persecution. I'm not in favor of getting rid of it because tomorrow there will be someone who will be worthy of that designation. So what we need to do is cut down on its abuse.